Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Sharp, and I would like to thank the SICB organizers for letting me give this talk about developing LGBTQIA+ inclusive biology classrooms and curricula. I'd like to start off by giving a land acknowledgement. I am currently giving this presentation on stolen land, which is the home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. I'd like to thank the K-State Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance for providing this land acknowledgement. If you're not in the same place as me, you can use the tool nativelands.ca to learn more about which ancestral lands you are on. I'd also like to acknowledge that as we discuss cultivating respectful attitudes and practices to support sex and gender diversity, that we acknowledge that European colonists historically targeted, stigmatized, and oppressed Indigenous peoples for having cultural gender roles beyond the male-female binary, and that this violence continues today. I'd next like to share a quote from the feminist scholar, Dr. Sarah Ahmed, who writes, "We learn about worlds when they do not accommodate us. Not being accommodated can be pedagogy. We generate ideas through the struggles we have to be in the world. We come to question worlds when we are in question." And I'd like to share this quote because although I have had many privileges, I frequently move through a world that has not accommodated me and constantly caused me to be called into question. And through my experiences teaching biology, it has come to feel essential that I challenge the paradigm of teaching that has directly harmed and erased me and my community and constantly made us feel non-accommodated and called into question. So I want to ask the question of who is accommodated when we teach a version of sex, gender, and sexuality that portrays biological sex as a universal binary determined at birth that comes in only 2 types, and extends this binary sex paradigm not only to humans, but also to various animals, plants, and fungi. And we see a lack of accommodation when human biological sex is represented by diagrams such as this one that conflate sex and gender by using gendered terms to refer to the parents who contribute different types of gametes to the next generation. Additionally, the reproductive event documented in this cycle is frequently the only form of sexuality mentioned in many biology textbooks, except in some cases when homosexuality is mentioned in discussions of AIDS. Collectively, this communicates to students that there is only one normal, natural, and biological way to have sex, gender, and sexuality. This type of teaching erases students who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, queer, asexual, intersex, or otherwise not straight, cisgender, and intersex. And for students who do not belong to these populations, this type of teaching can enforce harmful stereotypes and contribute to the weaponization of biology as a political tool used against the LGBTQIA+ community. So, who is left out of this type of biology instruction is an important question, as is what are the broader consequences of this type of teaching. I'm going to give some examples of how misunderstandings of biological sex as a binary are consistently used to invalidate and erase and endanger transgender and intersex individuals. Last year in the United States, over 100 anti-transgender bills were proposed in different legislatures, and many of them also have negative consequences for intersex individuals. An example of this is a bill that passed in Texas, which banned transgender girls from participating in female sports. If we look at the text of this bill, it highlights the need for children to play on a team that corresponds with their biological sex and not the opposite biological sex as defined by physical sex observed at birth and documented on birth certificates. Although 2022 has barely started, at least 7 states have already proposed anti-transgender bills, including one in Oklahoma that directs schools to prevent transgender individuals from using the bathroom that corresponds to their affirmed gender. Again, if we look at the text of this bill, it relies on a binary definition of biological sex as identified at birth. In addition to bills that seek to limit transgender students from participating in sports and using the bathroom that matches their gender, many bills also sought to deny health care access for gender affirming care to transgender youth. However, these bills also affect intersex youth because while gender affirming care to trans children is denied, doctors are allowed to explicitly, by the language in these bills, continue performing medically unnecessary cosmetic surgeries on intersex youth to make their bodies look less intersex. Next, I want to discuss where this idea of a biological sex binary came from, because it is not only insidious due to its contemporary usefulness in transphobic arguments, it was actually explicitly created to legitimize and perpetuate bigotry. So I want to briefly review the history of how these ideas came about. So prior to the 1800s, the prevailing hypothesis about human biological sex was that human bodies really just came in one sex, and male bodies were the superior version of that sex, while female bodies were the inferior version. In the 1800s, when gonads were discovered, there was a shift from a predominant one-sex model to a model of human sex consisting of two types as determined by gonads. Also in the 1800s, Darwin's hypotheses about natural selection and survival of the fittest were published, and this combination of increased understanding of evolution and shifts in understanding of sex led to the development of a perspective on sexual dimorphism that viewed it as a racial trait. This is rooted in eugenics, as eugenicists misappropriated Darwin's ideas to claim that non-white ethnic groups were less sexually dimorphic than heterosexual Europeans and therefore supposedly less evolved. They also extended this idea of less evolution leading to less sexual dimorphisms to certain groups of Europeans who were considered degenerate, including lesbians and sex workers. These bigoted ideas were justified by a pseudoscience called biometry, which used measurements of different body parts, and it was used to justify various eugenic laws and projects to cause harm and deny rights, autonomy, and life chances to non-white ethnic groups and European individuals seen as degenerate. This set the stage for the environment in which genital reconstructive surgeries were developed in the 1900s. And because of these ideas about sex, race, gender, and sexuality, when the surgeries became more available later into the 20th century, the predominant paradigm became that genital reconstructive surgeries were forced on intersex infants to make their bodies look more sex typical, and frequently denied from transgender adults who wanted to access the surgeries and were able to consent. And in both cases, justifications had to do with sex normativity and wanting to maintain this idea of a superior, more dimorphic type of body based on these racist eugenic ideas, and additional fears of homosexuality and the belief that having a non-sex and gender normative body would make somebody more likely to become homosexual. Although much has changed in our understandings of sex and gender in the last 70 years, our understandings of both remain racialized. These things are frequently conflated, and they're also used to deny access and autonomy to many different populations. Some examples of this include anti-transgender legislation, such as that discussed in the previous slide, including bathroom bills, trans sports bills, and as well as the denial of the rights of intersex women to compete in athletics, especially intersex women of color from the global South. This also includes the required sterilization of trans people in many places for them to access legal and medical transition, as well as the forced hysterectomies performed on immigrant women in ICE detention facilities. And this picture shows Christine Mboma and Beatrice Masalingi, who were Namibian sprinters, both of whom were prevented from competing in certain events during the 2021 Olympics because the International Olympic Committee has rules about what testosterone levels are permitted in individuals who wish to compete in certain women's track and field events. So now that we've discussed why ideas of a false biological sex binary are incredibly harmful, how can we get away from teaching biology based on these ideas? And this is a complex problem that will require a multifaceted solution, but I want to share some examples today of strategies that I have found helpful. So I think it's very important to give students an idea of just how diverse biological sex is across taxa. There are species that only have one sex, such as the New Mexico whip-tailed lizards, species that have thousands of mating types, including mushrooms in the phylum Basidiomycota, species where a single individual can have more than one type of gamete, such as in snails and most flowering plants. And there are types of species where an individual can switch from a fertile adult of one sex to a fertile adult of a different sex in the same lifetime. When defining biological sex, I think it's important to convey the variation and also be specific. So in many plants, animals, and fungi, gametes play an important role in biological sex, and sometimes a single individual can produce both types of gametes, sperm and ova, and this is called monoece, meaning one house. And in other organisms, different individuals produce sperm and ova, which is called dioece, meaning two houses. And in dioece, sex determination can either be chromosomal, environmental based, or based on social factors, like whether a larva encounters another individual of a certain sex before they exit the larval stage. When talking about human biological sex, I think nuance is even more important, given this racialized and eugenic history of how sex and gender are constructed. So I like to describe human sex characteristics as a collection of variable traits related directly or indirectly to sexual reproduction. And primary sex characteristics are present at birth in humans and include chromosomes, hormones, regions of the brain, and certain body structures, both internal and external. And the way that sex is currently legally and medically assigned in many parts of the world is based exclusively on external sex characteristics. In many cases, though sex is much more complicated than that. Humans develop secondary sex characteristics during puberty, all of which also vary along a spectrum. And intersex refers to people who are born with physical sex traits that do not fit on binary understandings of typical male or female biology. And there's many different ways to be intersex, as all of the different primary and secondary sex characteristics vary along a spectrum and can come in more than just two types. Based on a definition of intersex that includes variation in both primary and secondary sex characteristics, this accounts for at least 5% of the population. And I like to show this diagram, which is called the Quigley scale, because it shows that a trait that we often think of as binary, so external genitals, can actually come in a variety of different phenotypes. This is a diagram from a Scientific American article that I really like because it shows how intersex development can occur in many different ways. I'd also like to provide a note about discussing gender. So I define gender as a cultural system of categorization that applies specific social norms, expectations, and constraints to individuals who are perceived to belong to culturally recognized gender categories. And many people ask, why should we teach gender in biology class? And it's my opinion that not talking about gender at all is actually sending a strong message about gender because of the way that sex and gender are socially conflated, and that a binary understanding of both is used to justify transphobia, acknowledging to students that sex and gender are not the same thing, and that gender has a variety of cultural components, including how gender is expressed within a cultural context and how gender is perceived within a cultural context, can do a lot to separate it from biological sex. And we can also help avoid contributing to this conflation in how we teach by not using sex and gender interchangeably, even though that is sometimes done so colloquially. Other things that we can do to make biology classrooms more LGBTQIA+ inclusive, including asking students about their name, pronouns, and accessibility needs prior to the first day of class, so that you come into class already knowing this information about your students, clarifying inclusion policies in your own syllabus, choosing texts with diverse representation when possible, and pointing out to students when texts are not inclusive, being specific when defining and using biological sex, not gendering or using gender stereotypes for non-human organisms, using gamete-focused language such as overproducing tissue or sperm-producing structures rather than referring to sex categories as universal, providing examples of variation in investment, courtship, gestation, and parental care, and finally, when possible, advocating to include LGBTQIA+ individuals in diversity initiatives. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening to my talk and encourage you to reach out to me through email, on Twitter, and you can also follow me on YouTube, where I am Plant Role Models, which is the same as my Twitter handle. And with that, thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions and comments.